Chapter 3: The Worst Failure in American History. Author's Note: Chapter 3 is a very involved, detailed, and lengthy chapter, full of charts, data, and statistics. The primary purpose of the chapter is to provide the empirical argument that the millennial generation has failed in all major categories that matter. But if you either know that, or do not need to be convinced of it, you may consider skipping, or at least skimming, Chapter 3. Still, there are some good observations and points made in Chapter 3 that you may find it worth reading, but it is not necessary to enjoy the rest of the book. For audiobook listeners, because of the statistical nature of Chapter 3, there are a significant number of charts in the chapter that cannot be read. Hopefully the context of the book will fill in these gaps, but you may want to consider going to the library and getting a physical copy to visually follow along. Abomination, abortion, disaster. These are words that may cause offense and umbrage when it comes to describing an entire generation of humans. People may prefer terms such as train wreck, nuclear blast site, the Hindenburg, the Titanic, the Black Plague, or dumpster fire. But whatever pejorative we decide to label the millennial generation with, wasted crop is perhaps the most apt, because of the underlying intention to produce something of value. The Titanic was an accident, the Hindenburg the same. Train wrecks are rarely intentional, and nuclear blast sites are the result of intended and purposed destruction. Wasted crop, however, indicates there was at least the intention to do good, that there was an intention to bear fruit of some kind, and in addition to the intention, a tremendous amount of investment made to ensure the crop was successful. But despite these best efforts, the crop still failed, adding a sense of irony, tragedy, and futility to something that was doomed to be a disaster. In the case of millennials, there was never more of an investment made into a crop that failed. The millennials had more years and money invested in their educations than any other generation before. Their parents put them into sports, activities, clubs, often at the expense of spending time with them. Also, their children could be perfectly socialized. Millennials saw more psychologists, therapists, and counselors than any generation before them, and more life-coping drugs were given to the millennials than any crop fertilized in the past. Parents allowed millennials to live at home rent-free, and still do to this day, at ages last seen during the agricultural era. Parents even doted on their millennial children with perfectly privileged diets, such as gluten-free, organic, and fair trade. Even reality was bent or changed for the millennials by eliminating things like GPAs, grades, keeping score, honor rolls, valedictorians, self-supportation, budgeting, jobs, paying back your debts, and other harsh life realities, all to protect and promote millennial self-esteem. Practically every want, need, and desire was considered, coddled, and pandered to, giving the millennials every possible advantage at life. But just like any agricultural crop, you can overwater it and over-fertilize it, destroying the crop in the process. And that's precisely what's been done to the millennials. Though anybody with intellectual honesty, or common sense, knows the millennials are a wasted crop, a rather involved chapter is regrettably necessary to show just how spectacularly this crop has failed. Not only to provide perspective as well as proof, but to parry the very well anticipated howls and screams of millennials being offended that are guaranteed to come. But more importantly, this empirical chapter is necessary as it makes the compelling case as to exactly why you do not want to become a millennial, so we never waste trillions in money, labor, and resources on a failed crop of humans like this ever again. And though not an exhaustive chapter, covering every possible statistic of human success, it covers the key traditional metrics by which we have measured life success in the past. Education. Perhaps what the millennials will be most remembered for was the tremendous amount of money wasted on their educations. Not so much in terms of K-12 education, but college and other forms of higher education. Never had so many people wasted so much money on so many worthless degrees. But the relationship between millennials and education is not as simple as all that, nor can they be compared to previous generations, as college education has changed dramatically over the decades. A college degree does not hold the same value it did in the 1960s. Not everybody went to college in the past. And, of course, there is the price of tuition, which has increased at criminal rates. This confluence of events created an education bubble that was even larger than the housing bubble. And because of bad timing, the millennials were more or less forced to buy into this bubble. Sadly, this has given millennials a lifetime handicap many will never recover from. First, there is the value of these degrees. Many people like to give the millennials guff about their choice of degrees. sociology, gender studies, journalism, etc. And millennials should rightly be mocked and ridiculed for wasting 4 years of their lives and $75,000 of taxpayer money on these Mickey Mouse degrees. But for the most part, the percent of worthless degrees being conferred has never really changed over time. Ever since 1971, since the data has been available, about 85% of all degrees conferred were more or less worthless, either coming from the liberal arts, social sciences, or business schools. What did change was the market value of a degree. At one time, any degree was a good degree. That sheepskin was needed to get your foot in the door. College degrees of any variety did help you land a job. And today, one could very well make the argument that today's employers are delusional in requiring a college degree for nearly every entry-level job. But in pushing now 2 full generations into getting college degrees, the market has been flooded with college degrees, thus driving the economic value of said degrees down. In 1940, under 5% of the 25-plus population had a bachelor's degree. Today, it's now 1 in 3. With a 700% increase in the proportional population holding a college degree, it should be no surprise that the value of a college education has collapsed. Second, there's the quality of these degrees. The quality of today's colleges and the degrees they offer are a joke. At one time, you had to be truly intelligent, truly part of the intellectual elite to get accepted into college. Today, colleges will take anybody and teach anything. The trivium and classics are rarely taught in today's liberal arts programs. Half your courses are mere leftist propaganda masquerading themselves as prerequisite classes which do nothing to promote critical thinking, let alone have anything to do with your major. Admission standards have been lowered to where now anybody with a pulse can find a school that will take them. Even Texas A&M, however charitably intended, has officially started accepting mentally retarded students. Grade inflation is rampant, rendering GPAs and honor rolls meaningless. And this presumes your school still has an honor roll, as they wouldn't dare hurt the precious feelings of those snowflake students with subpar GPAs. At one time, a college degree actually meant something, but today it just means you attended high school version 2.0, which is absolutely no achievement. Third, today's college degrees may not be worthless. They might be worse than worthless, in that they're a liability. Understand, college is where social scientists tested their fancy social theories on students and programmed millennials with their fervent political religion. Safe spaces, protests, fake rape accusations, 48 genders, speech codes, social justice, entitlement, student loan bailouts, doxing, censorship, and above all else, professional victimhood. It's now a daily joke to look at the news and see what childlike petulant insanity our presumed institutions of higher learning are drilling into the heads of our youth today. This is arguably more costly to the students than the price of tuition itself, because students successfully indoctrinated with such self-pitying, childish political slop won't be able to function as adults in the real world. They will be mentally stunted, emotionally retarded, politically obsessed, and professional victims, making them a huge liability to employers. Not only will they fail at being productive employees, but because of their victimhood mentality, they are lawsuits just waiting to happen. Worse, it's not just employers who won't want anything to do with a victimhood studies major, but anybody who might have otherwise engaged with them in their future lives. Friends, colleagues, business partners, loved ones, even spouses. In short, with college education being more of a life-crippling mind virus than it is a galvanizing experience that improves one as an adult, you mentally handicap college students and thus destroy the quality of life these young men and women will be capable of enjoying, simply because no productive or quality person will want to have anything to do with them. This then leads to the fourth difference between degrees of today versus that of yesteryear: the consequences of these degrees. You take the quality, type, volume, and liability-like traits of these degrees, and it's a guarantee you'll be underemployed, if not outright unemployed. The waiter with a master's degree is a stereotype for a reason. What does a sociology major ask you? Do you want fries with that? It's a joke for the same. Today, nobody hires college graduates unless you have a skilled degree or trade that is in demand. This has resulted in most college graduates today being unemployed or underemployed, as well as completely confused, even depressed as to why they're not as successful as they were promised they'd be. But measuring the disproportionate unemployment and underemployment the millennial generation suffers is not as straightforward as one might imagine. Macroeconomic factors, such as the Great Recession, mask the data, and oftentimes the age-related unemployment data you're seeking simply doesn't exist. But using the information we do have, the millennials, despite being the most educated generation, are the most underemployed generation, certainly the most underutilized. The most direct measure would be to use the youth unemployment rate, which measures those 15 to 24 who are not employed. A noticeable spike occurs in 2008 when roughly the average age millennial is hitting the labor market and that age demographic. Unfortunately, this is more bad timing than the lack of a good degree, in that this is when the Great Recession occurred. Much of the unemployment can be explained by the Great Recession, but graduating with a bachelor's in English certainly didn't help you in 2009. The next best measure would be the labor force participation rate, which measures the percent of a group of people who are either gainfully employed or actively looking for a job. In short, people who actually want to work, whether they have a job or not. Thankfully, the data does date back to the 1940s and for an age cohort specific to 20 to 24-year-olds. The overall trend has been for 20 to 24-year-olds to participate in the labor force at an increasing rate since the 1950s, but this reflects the larger macroeconomic trend of women entering the labor force. But of particular note is the year 2002, when the oldest of millennials started reaching this age cohort and the labor force participation rate dropped, even though there was no recession. The Great Recession is particularly noticeable in 2007 to 8, but even during the sclerotic but inevitable recovery, 20 to 24-year-olds remained at low levels of labor force participation. It was not until 2018 that 20 to 24-year-olds started to participate in increasing numbers. But these were Gen Zers, not millennials, who by 2018 were 29 years old. This is a better indicator of the unemployability of millennials, their degrees, as well as their lack of work ethic. There is then the U6 underemployment rate, which is rather complicated but still provides us some insight into the employability and work ethic of the millennials. The official definition of U6 is total unemployed plus all marginally attached workers plus total employed part-time for economic reasons as a percent of all civilian labor force plus all marginally attached workers. Translated to English, this means the unemployment rate plus anybody who is working part-time plus recently discouraged workers, aka people who have recently given up looking for work. This all-encompassing statistic attempts to measure what is considered underemployment, meaning those who are not working at their full potential. So, for example, the secretary with a degree in communications, regretful as his degree might be, still is a college graduate and could very well be easily working in a higher economic capacity. Unfortunately, there is a problem with the U6 rate. It measures both unemployment and underemployment, not underemployment solely. So unemployment needs to be backed out. It also does not break down U6 across age groups, so the measure is for all people of all ages. To account for this, we can calculate underemployment as a percent of the U6 total. It not only backs out unemployment, allowing us to solely focus on underemployment, but it also allows us to look at U6 somewhat generationally, as we know the average millennial, born in 1989, hit the labor market in 2007 at age 18 and graduated in 2011 at age 22. Again, most noticeable is the housing market crash starting in 2008. Underemployment as a percent of the total went down because so many more people were becoming unemployed as opposed to merely underemployed. Bad timing as it was, millennials were entering either the labor market or college at this time, some of the elder millennials, even worse, graduating from college into this horrible economy. But what is particularly interesting is how underemployment went up over the course of the recovery. And not only up, but up to record levels in 2014, where it has stubbornly remained. But even more perplexing is it has remained this high even in the face of record low unemployment, where the unemployment rate has been consistently below 4%. The last time this happened was in 1969. If you want to pour yourself a drink at this moment, I don't blame you, but the CliffsNotes version is this. Even with the economic recovery and super low unemployment, all the education in the world didn't do anything to help the millennial generation. They are underemployed at record levels. It's what's given rise to the term gig economy, as there are no careers, only gigs. And it's why nearly every waiter, waitress, barista, bartender, hotel clerk, retail worker, gas station attendant, and even babysitter/nanny has a college degree. This is the most convincing evidence that the millennials wasted their youth on their college educations. And this is the price they pay for flooding the labor market with worthless, low-quality degrees. Well, maybe not the actual price. That would be the fifth and final generational difference in college educations, the financial price millennials paid for their degrees. Skyrocketing tuition is no secret, and has done nothing but skyrocket, going up 1,400%, while inflation in the US has only increased by 389% since 1978. At one time, you could be a boomer, work a part-time job, perhaps a summer job as well, and pay for a degree, in full, that still had some economic value. Even as a Gen Xer, it was possible, not fun, but possible, to work full-time, attend a community college, get in-state tuition, and pay your way through college. Now it is simply impossible. The average tuition for a year of college is $20,000, the average between public and private schools, and this says nothing about the living expenses one needs to incur while attending school. Problem is, parents, guidance counselors, teachers, and nearly every adult in millennials' lives were screaming that they must go to college. Therefore, there was only one solution: debt. And so, over the past decade alone, total outstanding student debt nearly tripled to $1.5 trillion as millennials borrowed more and more insane sums to pay for these less and less valuable college degrees. In flooding the market with student loans, it was no surprise then that the average loan balance a student would graduate with went from $9,900 in 1993 to over $36,000 today. And if wasting 4 years of your youth on a completely worthless degree wasn't insulting enough, this added financial burden was the one that metaphorically broke the millennials' back. Because if it wasn't already going to be an uphill battle to find a job with a worthless degree, the added loan servicing costs of $36,000 was just about the worst handicap a person could have just starting out in their adult life. Finance and economics. Decisions made in their educational pasts largely set the tone and direction for millennials' financial, professional, and economic futures, most notably hindering them from pursuing economic success and advancement, even if they may have a decent paying career. Things such as homeownership, adequately funded retirements, even a living wage are out of reach of many millennials today. But rue and lament the current financial plight of millennials, it doesn't change the fact that they will have to work double time to stand any chance of having a normal financial future. Unfortunately, many are so behind the financial 8-ball it may be mathematically impossible for some millennials to even achieve financial normalcy, let alone success, in their entire lives. First, millennials' degrees did nothing to protect them from the Great Recession, and the decreasing real wages that came with it. Admittedly, the Great Recession was not the millennials' fault, but it was not until Generation Z came online, along with the economic recovery, that real wages increased for 20 to 24-year-olds. Worse, for college-educated millennials, it seems the value of a college degree has actually gone down, while the trades, wage jobs, construction, and other previously ridiculed professions experienced an increase in wages. It behooves the question, why go to college at all, if merely partaking in a 2-year trade program would have resulted in higher wages? And it must really sting that while the true value of a college degree hasn't changed in 50 years, millennials paid 5 times the price tag people did 50 years ago. When all is said and done, all the effort, toil, money, and labor invested in millennials' education was more or less for naught. It did nothing to help them have an income-earning edge over their baby boomer parents or Gen X siblings. If anything, it made things worse. To quote the Federal Reserve study, Are Millennials Any Different? Quote, they found that after controlling for age, work status, and other demographic variables, Generation X and baby boomer families had higher household incomes by 11% and 14% respectively. The differences are even more pronounced when female and male heads of household are looked at separately. Among female heads of household, again controlling for age, work status, and other demographic variables, Generation X and baby boomer workers had 12 and 24% higher earnings respectively. Among males, Generation Xers earned 18% more and baby boomers earned 27% more. But hey, at least they got the college experience. Second, debts. I foolishly held the notion that Gen Xers would usher in an era of stable nuclear families because they had been so destroyed by the divorce epidemic of their baby boomer parents. Why would you want to go through that again? Why would you want to do that to your kids? Surely Generation X would grow up to become the stable June and Ward Cleaver family we so desperately wanted to have. Apparently, I was wrong, as Gen Xers are now competing with baby boomers for the gold medal in the divorce Olympics. The same thing applies to millennials and their debts. You would think that out of all the generations, the millennials would become minimalists, taking vows of poverty and eschewing debt whenever they could. That they would be like their World War II grandparents who remembered the Great Depression and became miserly with their money. Apparently not, because instead of paying down their debts, millennials have taken on even more. The chart above is somewhat misleading because only 33% of millennials own a home. Thus, the true financial picture of the millennial generation is one where their largest debt is their student loans, closely followed by auto loans, and then a token amount of credit card debt. The obvious question is, where did all this auto debt come from? One would think the generation that is demanding the taxpayer bail them out of their student loans would at least do the rest of us the courtesy of not borrowing any more. Furthermore, with the average millennial making $35,592, you'd hope they'd get by with a cheap used car, perhaps public transportation. But it's as if immediately upon graduating, the millennials deemed themselves worthy of a new car, incurring nearly the same amount of debt in auto loans as they did student loans, doubling their financial woes. Perhaps this financial stupidity is just YOLO, the generational motto that epitomizes the millennials. But motto or not, buying a new car has sealed the financial fate of millions of millennials. Third, net worth and savings. Doing a generational comparison of net worth and savings is a bit difficult, as obviously the older you are, the more wealth you will have saved up. So it would be unfair to compare a generation that just recently graduated from college against a generation who is buying their second home in Florida and their third collector car while attending a Rolling Stones concert for $300 a ticket. Thankfully, 3 economists at the Federal Reserve, Chris Kurtz, Ging Lee, and Daniel Vine, published a study comparing the average balance sheet for millennials, baby boomers, and Gen Xers, adjusted for age and inflation, allowing for an intergenerational comparison. The results confirm what we've all suspected and the millennials have certainly felt. The millennials are the first generation to be worse off than their parents. This is worse than you think, since the general trend in American and world history is one of progress. It's doubly worse in that this regression is in the face of great technological, managerial, and financial advancements in the economy. Yet despite the advent of the internet, telecommuting, online financial services, even the American oil boom, millennials have actually lost ground as a generation. The problem is millennials' balance sheets are in much worse shape than portrayed above, because those statistics include homeowners, of which 67% of millennials are not. Making it even worse is that the above statistics also include millennials who have stocks or retirement accounts, of which only 15% of millennials have, or at least contribute to. When you back out the minority of millennials who are lucky enough to have retirement accounts and their own home, their average net worth is not a lofty $91,700, but rather a paltry $8,000 to $10,000, depending on the study you wish to cite. There is a bit of hope and reprieve for the millennials when it comes to savings, however. They are on par with their baby boomer and Gen X peers when it comes to savings. 71% of millennials have some kind of retirement account, though, once again, most do not have a significant balance in it, compared to 77% and 78% for baby boomers and Gen Xers, respectively. Millennials' bank savings are also on par with previous generations, where roughly 60% of them have $1,000 or less in their savings account. Sadly, as you might have surmised, on par means grossly inadequate, as both the boomers and Gen Xers are woefully unprepared for retirement as well. The majority of people, regardless of age, do not have enough in savings to sustain them for a 3-month emergency, and only 1/3 of boomers have enough savings to retire, even though they're of retirement age. If there's a participation trophy in general competition, adequately saving for retirement is it, because everyone's a loser. The last and final note on millennials and their debts is that it may not be over. Since millennials chose poorly when it came to their college degrees, they are likely to incur even more student loans as they'll inevitably be forced to go back to college. No data exists on the percent of millennials returning to college to retool and actually learn a worthwhile skill, but if master's degrees are any indication as to the worthlessness of their original degree choice, it shows millennials doubling down on college, and college debt, to return to even more schooling. The x-axis of the chart is somewhat misleading, as data points were only available every 5 years up to 2005, but the general trend is similar to that of bachelor's degrees. The market is being increasingly flooded with master's degrees as well, partially confirming young people today are more or less forced to return to college. Soon the day will come a master's degree will be the equivalent of a 1950s high school diploma, just like bachelor's degrees are today. The final and arguably most vital metric of millennial economic success is homeownership. There are good and many arguments that homeownership is not for everyone, and oftentimes it is financially better off to rent, but in the long run, if done right, achieving the American dream of homeownership is, in general, a very good sign of economic success, especially if you use the traditional definition of the American dream where your house is paid off. Once again, when you adjust for age, millennials are dead last. The reasons for this delay in homeownership are many. Older millennials were dumped into the labor market during the Great Recession. Banks were also very reluctant to lend as they were recovering from the financial crisis. Lower wages and salaries are also to blame for the deficit in homeownership. But the main culprit is the most obvious one: student debt. With student loans and their servicing costs oftentimes costing as much as rent, millennials are simply not financially able to afford a home. Worse, while older millennials may have been lucky to buy at the bottom of the market when the houses were affordable, today the housing market has been re-inflated, pricing most millennials out of the market. It's only worsened by the fact that rents have also increased faster than inflation, forcing millennials into a permanent financial purgatory where they may never muster up the down payment nor the finances to afford themselves a home. But once again, the college experience must have totally been worth it. Romance, sex, marriage, and family formation. A common question I get from younger men is it worth getting my own apartment so me and my girlfriend can have sex? The answer is no, rent a hotel or go to her place. The relationship probably won't last, so the occasional hotel or month-long Airbnb is cheaper. But this highlights a huge handicap millennials face. If you don't own your own home, let alone have your own place, you are putting the most important thing in life on hold, perhaps indefinitely. And that most important thing in life is family formation. At first, many millennials may scoff at this, thinking it's either their career or traveling, or perhaps their precious politics that is the most important in life. And certainly, many young people today simply aren't ready, either financially or career-wise, to start having a family. And this is understandable, as they may not quite be at that point in their lives yet. But can you at least move out of your parents' home? Can you at least get your driver's license? How about getting off the phone and actually going out on a physical date? The problem with millennials is some of them are so far behind when it comes to finding a spouse, starting a family, and owning a home, they have to go back to some 6th grade basics about dating, courting, even hygiene. And whereas every generation before them has certainly had their mockable eccentricities, ask any Gen Xer about putting acid-laced pacifiers in their mouths in the 90s, some basic 101 lessons have to be addressed first. Living at home, for example, is certainly understandable up to a point. The price of tuition, the price of rent, those two variables alone legitimize living with your folks until you graduate at 22 or get on your feet. But living at home until you're 25? 30? Even 35? Thankfully, the 35-year-old who lives at home is more of an anecdotal news story than it is a fact, as only 15% of millennials live with their parents today. But millennials have practically doubled the rate of living at home over previous generations, returning to levels last seen during the agricultural era. And the only reason young adults lived at home back then was because they had to work on the farm back in 1890. Today, there is no excuse. If you live at home, even if you're living with roommates into your 30s, you're putting a huge crimp in your dating/love life, and thus your chances of starting a family. Then there's my favorite form of parasitism, because Gen Xers were just as guilty of this: sponging off your parents. At house parties in the 90s, there would always be that proud, young 20-something girl who claimed she was independent and supported herself as she boldly pursued her master's degree in fuzzy bunny studies. There was also always that guy at parties who pulled up in a brand new sports car and somehow managed to afford himself a sweet loft in downtown, replete with those slick 1990s CD towers. On the outside, it looked like they had a job that paid 3 times what yours did, a bank account with 3 times the money in it, and a bonus check you wished you had. But it was something much simpler than that. Their parents were still giving them money. Whether your parents are paying your rent, making your car payment, paying your credit card, buying your insurance, helping with the down payment, paying down your loans, or even paying your cell phone bill, you are not independent. You are not an adult. You are still an adult child who needs to suck off mommy and daddy's financial teat. And for all points and purposes, even if you have your own apartment, you are still, metaphorically, a child living at home. When we use this more financially accurate metric of living at home, it's exponentially worse. Half of today's parents still give their adult children money, and a third plan to help their kids pay back their student loans. And while there's no way to tell how long this parental welfare check will continue, if we use the 10-year average it takes to pay back student loans, we can roughly approximate that half of young adults will continue to be financially dependent on their parents well into their 30s. Again, most millennials may be more preoccupied with finding cheaper rent and paying off their student loans than getting married or having kids, but if your future plans included either, How can you support a family if you can't even support yourself? Your driver's license is another basic requirement to becoming an adult. Thankfully, now that the average millennial is approaching 30 years of age, this is less of a problem. But if a measure ever did measure the failure of a generation to launch, it would be getting their driver's licenses. A driver's license is an absolute must for every reason in American society. It gets you freedom from your parents, so you no longer need to rely on them for transportation. It allows you to visit with your friends and participate in activities that would not have been possible otherwise. It opens up nearly all of the country to you, giving you unlimited options to explore life in ways you couldn't before. And finally, it allows you to date, alone, without a parental chaperone. All of these freedoms afforded to you by a driver's license is the first big and real step into the adult world, and is absolutely necessary to become a grown man or woman. And it was because of all these freedoms that every American 16-year-old was compelled to make damn sure they'd pass their driver's test, even if they flunked every test they ever took since kindergarten. That was until the Millennials. Though the majority of Millennials did get their licenses, it was a dramatic drop from the levels attained by their Gen X siblings. As Gen Xers, we made damn sure we got our licenses, with 92% of us earning them by the age of 20. And we would mock and ridicule the 8% of the idiots that didn't. But even with all the freedoms, benefits, and perks that come with having a driver's license, not to mention the shame and ridicule you'd incur if you didn't get one, the very first millennials issued driver's licenses to the point only 80% would get one by the time they were in their 20s. Their younger millennial siblings performed even worse, dropping that percentage to only 76%. A full 1 in 4 millennials didn't have their licenses by the time they were graduating from college. Admittedly, online dating can be fun, and you can go ahead and believe you're saving the environment taking public transportation, but you're not fooling anyone. You were just too damn lazy to be bothered to learn to drive and pass a test. And when you combine such incredible laziness with the lack of a driver's license and a lack of a car, you seriously hamper your ability to date, court, and inevitably get married. It should be no surprise, then, that while living at home and without a driver's license, not to mention needing to borrow money from dad to go on a date, your dating life might suffer. But here, there is good news for the millennials. Because in order for your dating life to suffer, you first need to have one. And it seems the majority of millennials have none. According to a survey put out by Singles in America, the average millennial has only managed a paltry 1.43 dates in 2018. Worse, a full 56% of millennials didn't even manage a date at all in 2018. Dating has never been easy for any generation, but even in the worst of times, your average Gen Xer, baby boomer, or even prudish World War II vet could score more than 1.43 dates per year. Unfortunately, there is shockingly little data on how much dating previous generations did in their youth, but with some, admittedly very unscientific online/social media polling, Gen Xers and baby boomers ever so roughly managed 9.3 and 4.7 dates per year respectively in their dating prime. It should also be no surprise then, with less dating, that there would be less sex for the millennials. After several much heralded articles and studies from 2016 to 18 citing the saucy details of millennials' sex lives, it came to light that millennials were having sex less frequently than any generation in 60 years. Of course, this was a play on statistics to gin up clickbait traffic, as that claim was technically true, but the millennials were nowhere near as prudish as their silent generation grandparents. Millennials, on average, and so far, mind you, have had 8 lifetime sex partners, down from 11 their promiscuous baby boomer parents notched up, but more than twice that of the silent generation. This, combined with their paltry dating statistics, suggests that a fair amount of millennials are skipping dating altogether and going straight to sex, which there's nothing wrong with. It's just sex without dating doesn't necessarily lead to family formation or meeting the love of your life. You combine these 4 items, less dating, less sex, less money, and living at home, and the logical conclusion is less marriage. If you're not even getting out there meeting members of the opposite sex, let alone have the money to date them, let alone have a place to take them back to should you get lucky, marriage is definitely going to be postponed well into the future. But there are other compelling reasons millennials are postponing marriage, none of which are necessarily their own fault, nor foolish. First, there is the fear of divorce. Many millennial men and women distinctly remember their baby boomer parents getting divorced and the utter destruction it wreaked upon their family. None of them want to repeat that horrific and unforgivable mistake, let alone irreparably harm their own would-be children. So nobody can very well blame them if they're a little gun-shy on marriage. Additionally, millennial men in particular are doubly reluctant to marry. Not only do women initiate the majority of divorces, but millennial men now have witnessed 3 generations of other men getting divorced. Their fathers were divorced when they were young children, their older Gen X brothers when they were teenagers, and today every millennial man knows at least one friend who's been divorced. And since it is still the men who do the proposing, and women who do the divorcing, they are also a little bit gun-shy to commit to a woman, often choosing to cohabitate instead, since it's legally safer. Second, it's prudent and wise to wait until you're financially ready to marry and have children. Unfortunate as it may be, the truth is millennials do have large sums of debt that need to be taken care of before taking on the fiscal responsibilities of starting a family. Combining this with the lackluster earnings millennials face in the labor market, one almost has to tip their hat to them for making such a mature decision, rather than just spreading their legs, breeding, and then letting the taxpayer be their insurance policy if things don't work out. They're putting much more thought into family formation than their parents did, and it is certainly wise to do so. Third, related to student loans is an unfortunate financial reality most millennial women face. Since the majority of college graduates are women, that means the majority of student debtors are also women. This would be perfectly fine, if not an outright victory for women's rights, if women weren't majoring in worthless subjects at twice the rate of men. So whereas a guy who has $40,000 in student loans for a degree in actuarial science has nothing to worry about, a woman who has $40,000 in student loans for a degree in journalism most certainly does. In this sense, women not only have a huge financial burden to overcome, but they are also now a huge financial liability to any quality man that might have otherwise been interested in marrying them. Men having their own student loans to pay off is already a burden enough, but adding the financial liability of paying off a prospective wife's student loans for a degree that has no economic value, and then add the cost for a wedding, children, and a mortgage, most men are simply going to pass on debt-laden women and try their luck finding the rare female who majored in engineering, actuarial science, or accounting, or perhaps didn't even go to college at all. This, unfortunately, leaves the majority of millennial women as perma-financial liabilities, which further postpones any dreams they might have of marriage and children. Fourth, further pinching them for time, women need to avail themselves of their 17 years, 19 if you include master's graduates, of K through college education. They invested nearly 2 decades of their youth going to school, and it would be a tragedy if they didn't put that education to use. Young women need to establish a career, advance their profession, pay off their debts, perhaps get advanced degrees, and make something of themselves before committing to a family. And I don't think anybody would fault them if they dared to have a little fun in life now that they are no longer burdened with school. Ergo, just as men are in no rush to get to the altar because of divorce, alimony, and half your assets, women are also just as reluctant to marry because of the massive investment they made into their educations, their careers, and themselves. Fifth, while women have been pursuing careers and educations to be on par with men, there has been a tragic, ironic, and unforeseen consequence of doing so. The elimination of quality, marriageable men. In pursuing education and careers, women have nobly and admirably attempted to achieve parity with men. But a tragic irony of female nature is women in general prefer to marry up. This means marrying a man who makes more, has more education, and other signs of status/wealth that women are normally attracted to. But when Cornell University did a study comparing what unmarried women wanted out of men versus what the available pool of bachelors offered, they found that the men came up short, terming them economically unattractive men. According to the study, women demanded men make 58% more than what available bachelors were currently making. Women also demanded men be 30% more employed than what American bachelors were. And there is 20% more demand for college-educated men than what the American bachelor market currently has on inventory. Sadly, in pursuing a career in education, women have unintentionally priced a significant number of men out of the marriage market. If you get a master's degree and earn $100,000, but insist on having a man with more education who also makes more money, you're looking at less than 0.7%, 0.7% of the male population. And this says nothing about whether he's tall, dark, and handsome, let alone hygienic. Worse, this pits women's financial and professional interests against their romantic and hypergamous ones. A woman should achieve the most she can in terms of her career and her profession. But unless she's willing to date down, she, at the same time, severely limits the number of quality men who might make a good husband, and also severely limits the chances she'll have children. This inner conflict, no doubt, has also delayed some marriages or families from forming as well. Finally, kids. Given what the millennials have been through, it is perfectly understandable when it comes to kids, many millennials can take it or leave it. Normally, children were the strongest, most powerful biological force in a human's life. It was the number one thing that brought joy to parents, and was the number one thing they lived for. But when you look at millennials' debts, their poor economic prospects, their poor upbringings, not to mention the decade they lost following the lies of their parents, teachers, politicians, professors, and social scientists, you can see where some might truly be meh about having kids. They can barely support themselves, so why make a miserable life even more miserable? Alas, it should be no surprise that very few people are having children, and if they do, it's merely one or two, not enough to even achieve the replacement rate for the population. Of course, failing to replace your own population is the evolutionary definition of a failed generation, but it is still understandable why millennials are postponing children or choosing not to have them at all. Physical health. There is not much that can be said about the physical health of millennials that cannot be said of all Americans. We're all getting fatter, we're all getting lazier, and we're not getting enough exercise. Everybody is experiencing health issues earlier than previous generations did, and it's obesity, not a specific generation, that is the cause. Further complicating a comparison of millennial health to other generations is millennials are just too darn young. They're not old enough to really have developed any kind of medical conditions or ailments, though that may be changing, so until they do, a generational comparison of health is not really possible. But millennials do indeed suffer in a unique way when it comes to what few health problems they do have. And it's not so much because of actual bad health, but bad timing. Because today millennials are in their prime years for dating, love, marriage, and potentially children. And when you throw obesity, low testosterone, and STDs into the mix, you throw a really big wrench into those plans. First, big is not beautiful. It's gross. It's disgusting. It's revolting, and nobody likes it. You know it. I know it. You know I know you know it. So don't act all offended and shocked that somebody dared point out the obvious. This doesn't mean fat people are morally bad or there is something ethically wrong with them. It just means they're physically unattractive. The vast majority of people will not want to be with them, either sexually or romantically. Thankfully, fat people are not alone. Matter of fact, they're the majority, as 40% of American adults are obese and 71% are overweight. But this spells doom for millennials, especially when you consider how young they are, how fat they are currently, and how fat they're forecasted to be. Until the Gen Zers came online, millennials were the fattest kids Americans had ever seen. And they are forecasted to be the most overweight generation of adults by the time they reach their 30s and 40s. But a mere inspection of the American public would have told you this. An interesting intellectual exercise is to try to purposely focus on everybody when you're out in public. This is harder to do than you might think, because the human eye naturally gravitates towards what is pretty, pleasant, handsome, or attractive. But if you force yourself to look at everybody, you will be appalled at the physical appearance of most Americans, including the millennials. With so many unattractive people, how many men are going to be prompted to ask a woman out? And how many women will fear a man might ask them out? This isn't to say the marginally attractive millennials won't begrudgingly pair up with other marginally attractive millennials and have really crappy sex, but there will be absolutely no lust, passion, carnal desire, or vigor that would normally prompt men into action and women to gladly capitulate. Alas, the poor finances of the millennials are certainly postponing marriages, but so too are the extra rolls of fat on 20-something bodies that weren't there a mere generation ago. Second, related to obesity, testosterone, or the lack thereof. If there was a stereotype that did millennial males no favors, it has to be the try-guys. Weak, effeminate, and limp-wristed, the try-guys are a quartet of millennial boys who host a popular YouTube channel where they essentially make complete asses of themselves. On one of their episodes, they tested their testosterone levels, and the results were not a surprise. Their respective scores were 363, 259, 252, and 212. The average 20-something should have a score in the high 600s. Men in their 50s had double what the try-guys did at half their age. But the try-guys are not an anomaly, but rather representative of a trend affecting younger men, lower testosterone. Depending on the study you'd like to cite, testosterone levels among men have been going down provably from the 1960s, likely from the 1920s, and logically from the Industrial Revolution. There are some obvious explanations for this. Men today engage in less manual labor, clicking mice and uploading files rather than farming land and mining coal. Working conditions are also less taxing, with luxuries such as climate control and coffee breaks. And work has been postponed from the age of 12, when kids could work in the shipyards, to 22, when most men get their first cushy desk job, replete with free frappuccinos at the office. But millennial male behaviors also contribute to this trend, even accelerate it. Porn, video games, lethargy, and an outright dread of the gym has turned many millennial boys into soft, squishy piles of video gaming goo. Welfare programs, government handouts, and living with mom till 35 has also provided for cushy lifestyles their forefathers would never have lowered themselves to. And their outright cowardice when it comes to asking women out, especially in person, deprives them of the galvanizing experience of rejection that is key to becoming a man. We can also not ignore the increasingly anti-male and anti-masculinity environment millennial males have been brought up in. From kindergarten to college, all millennial men have heard is how great women are and how they are privileged oppressors. From the sensitive 90s man propaganda of the 1990s to Gillette's blatant anti-male toxic masculinity commercial in 2019, established institutions in America have clearly been pushing an agenda against masculinity. Preferential treatment, no matter how well-intended under the euphemism of affirmative action, has made it official policy in America to hire, promote, and give scholarships to women over men. And the non-stop, 24/7, constant cacophony of rah-rah you go girl woman worship these past 5 years, without an equal celebration of boys and men, has taken its tiring toll on testosterone as well. But perhaps the most detrimental has been feminism's clear and decades-long message to men and boys that women don't need them, when women are all that men ever really wanted in life. Women may not see these things happening in society, and no doubt are blinded by their millennial religion that insists they're the ones who are oppressed, but men and young boys have certainly been paying attention, and this is the reason many have failed to grow up to be real men. Finally, perhaps the main torpedo that has sank young men's testosterone is that young women today are just not physically attractive. They just don't fire up the old testosterone engines in men. It's often claimed erectile dysfunction and low T is caused by aging or some other biophysiological cause among older men. But an additional and likely reason is that their wives got fat and their husbands no longer want to fuck them. The whole point of testosterone is for men to procreate and have sex with women. But if your pool of women is obese, overweight, and tatted up, while also giving men an earful of feminist politics and girl power propaganda, male biology is simply not going to produce the testosterone needed to make them masculine, because why would you want to procreate with that? Sadly, this becomes a downward spiral as unattractive women depress men into becoming unattractive men, which further disincentivizes women to become attractive, which further disincentivizes men to do the same. Soon you go from Rita Hayworth to Cardi B and Cary Grant to Seth Rogen, and in 3 generations nobody can get passionate about anything. Though the most recent data for dropping testosterone levels is from 2007, and there is seemingly no data about the average testosterone levels in millennial males today, there are some convincing proxy measures that show a further decrease, even increased deceleration in men's testosterone. A 2017 study in the Journal of Urology showed a 400% increase in testosterone replacement therapy for men from 2003 to 2013, indicating at least more men were aware they had low testosterone. In 2016, the internet went ablaze mocking millennial men for having weaker grip strength than their grandfathers did when the National Center for Biological Information released a study proving so. But perhaps most convincingly is a 2016 YouGov poll that showed younger men self-reporting feeling more feminine at over 3 times the rate their grandfathers did, and androgynously so at 3.5 times. Whatever the true testosterone levels millennial men have, the result is the same. You have a generation of weaker, effeminate, androgynous men who can't defend their families and are physically less attractive than generations of men past. And though they are a perfectly groomed generation of men, replete with very pretty beards, just ask any young woman today about her dating experiences, and her response will be sheer exasperation and sexual frustration. And then there are STDs. The prevalence of STDs is difficult to nail down because some are curable and others are not. Different races have drastically different infection rates, oftentimes heavily skewing statistics. High-risk groups with high-risk behaviors do the same. Women are more prone to contract STDs than men, and like music, some STDs become very popular, others fall out of fashion, and completely new genres of STDs are created or discovered just the same. It also doesn't help that the CDC and US Department of Health are absolutely abysmal when it comes to statistics, consistency, and methodology when reporting its statistics. It's impossible to paint an accurate picture of the sexually transmitted disease market millennials face or created for themselves compared to the generations of the past. But the STD environment millennials face is basically a potpourri of good and bad news, mostly skewing towards bad. The main bad news is the US is experiencing a resurgence in 5 main STDs: gonorrhea, syphilis, hepatitis, chlamydia, and HPV. It is estimated there are 20 million new STD infections a year, nearly half of which are contracted by younger people, as they are the most sexually active. Gonorrhea, syphilis, and chlamydia are well-known diseases which have seen their popularity rise with either prostitution during war, the baby boomers, or simple neglect when it comes to sexual health. And their most recent resurgence is due to precisely that: poor sexual health decisions, not getting screened, not using condoms, and multiple poorly screened partners. Hepatitis C is on the rise because of the opioid epidemic and the shared needles and sexual behaviors that come with it. And HPV is on the rise as it is a very recently discovered STD, and its core incident rate has yet to be discovered. The main good news is that most of these, syphilis, chlamydia, hep C, and gonorrhea, are curable. But the bad news is that HPV is not, and gonorrhea is bordering on becoming incurable as the disease is evolving to be resistant to treatment. But the good news, as good as such news can be anyway, is that a statistically small percent of the population are high-risk groups that skew the data, so the overall incidence and prevalence rates are somewhat overstated for the overall population. But the bad news is there's still a significant percent of the population that has both curable and incurable STDs, the number of which will only go up over time as a higher and higher percent of the population contracts an incurable STD. If you can strain your eyes and look at the STD glass as half full because the epidemic of gonorrhea, syphilis, and chlamydia is curable, and only focus on the incurable ones, there's some more, you guessed it, good and bad news. The good news is the prevalence rates of incurable STDs like HIV, herpes, even HPV are going down. HPV is going up/stabilizing, but again, this is more likely due to new cases being discovered than the real rate going up. The bad news is there's still a significant percent of the population that has these diseases. Thankfully, HIV/AIDS is a relatively uncommon STD and largely relegated to the non-binary community, but it is estimated that about 1 in 5 people have herpes too. This is in the backdrop that the CDC estimates half the adult population will get at least one STD over the course of their life. When you combine all the good and bad news together, the takeaway is this: millennials may be having less sex than the boomers or Xers, but they're not the prudes their grandparents were. In averaging 8 sexual partners, it's a statistical guarantee they've slept with at least one person who's had an STD, and because screening has gone down, millions of them don't even know they're carriers. However, it is not so much their fornication that is the problem as much as it is their irresponsible and lackadaisical approach to safe sex and their sexual health, which is the primary cause of the resurgence we see in STDs today. Furthermore, the percent of one's generation that has an incurable STD only goes up with time. So, when you combine this with the trend of millennials postponing marriage, they face dwindling odds they'll find an STD-free spouse, let alone one who's never had an STD in his or her life. I know getting a driver's license must have really been a pain, but for the love of God, could you at least get screened for STDs out of respect for your fellow millennial? Mental health. Whatever physical health you afford the millennials, it certainly didn't protect their mental health, because after watching their parents get divorced, wasting their entire youth on an unemployable education, being dumped into the labor market during the Great Recession, being financially crippled forever with the albatross of debt around their necks, being denied the American dream, being driven insane because what they were promised was never delivered, having the epiphany that they've wasted their entire life, and realizing their entire life has been nothing but a lie, it's understandable that millennials might have some mental health issues. Matter of fact, there'd be something wrong with them if they didn't. The problem, however, is that millennial mental health is such a hornet's nest of sociology, psychology, economics, politics, and bad timing, Scores of books could be written on the matter and we still wouldn't even come close to summarizing it. Making matters more complicated is that the mental state of young people today is dynamic and constantly changing. With new data about relatively new mental illnesses, Asperger's, ADHD, and autism most notably, coming to light, the subject of millennial mental health is a constantly moving target. In short, a simple segment within a single chapter won't do millennial mental health justice, but the abbreviated version is this: the millennials are messed up. By nearly every measure, millennials suffer more mental illness than any of their generational counterparts, and you needn't a doctorate in psychology to know this. You can look at the percent of people by age who report having some form of mental illness. You can look at the near 50% increase in the rate at which millennials and Gen Zers report depression, suicidal ideation, or anxiety. You can look at Asperger's prevalence estimates increasing over time. You can look at the most millennial mental illness of them all, ADHD/ADD. You can look at something more cryptic and concrete, such as suicide rates by age cohort. You can even look at something much darker, like self-harm/body mutilation. Whatever the source or metric, you can read almost any mental health report and see how nearly every measure shows not only a deterioration in society's overall mental health, but an especially pronounced decline in the mental health of millennials and other younger generations. However you measure it, millennials as a generation suffer mentally significantly more than any other generation alive today and arguably in the past. And until their economic, financial, and love lives improve, they can expect this misery to continue. To deal with these problems, millennials have turned to the same solution generations before them did. Diet and exercise? No. Healthy living with healthy habits? No. Lifestyle changes for the better? No. Religion? No. Drugs. Lots and lots of drugs. Because making actual changes in your life is hard. Giving up vices you're addicted to just isn't fun. Who wants to go to the gym, stop watching porn, go for a run, and eat a low-carb diet? And besides, YOLO, am I right? So why eat healthy, work out regularly, and make the sacrifices that are necessary to biophysiologically heal yourself when you can just pop a pill, mask your problems, never solve them, and continue living a life of bad choices, bad mistakes, and eternal crippling regret? It truly is the American way. Millennials have some very unique drug use habits that differentiate them from other generations. Nearly every generation uses drugs the most when they're young. Nearly every generation tapers off as they grow up and get older. And it needs to be stated that, like divorce, baby boomers are the undisputed world champions of drug use in nearly every category. But the millennials are putting up a valiant effort for second place, especially in 4 notable drug categories: heroin, painkillers, tranquilizers, and psychotherapeutics. These 4 drug types are really in essence just 2: pain-killing drugs and drugs that treat mental illness. Painkillers/heroin/opioids are used to treat physical pain and are the cause of the current opioid epidemic destroying Middle America. Tranquilizers and psychotherapeutic drugs treat mental illnesses, ranging anything from schizophrenia to anxiety, and also Venn diagrammed together because tranquilizers are just a subcategory of psychotherapeutic drugs. Millennials stand out in the abuse of these drugs because their drugs of choice can largely be defined and identified by function, telling you what ails the millennial generation. For example, pot, cocaine, hallucinogens, alcohol, even meth are for recreation and fun. But every generation has used and abused these drugs in roughly equal measure during their youth, except for meth, which is a recent innovation. But the current opioid epidemic has largely been caused by pharmaceuticals introducing these drugs into the legal prescription drug market, rather than any sociological reasons specific to the millennial generation. But tranquilizers and psychotherapeutics have one purpose and one purpose only: to treat mental illness. And while nobody beats the boomers when it comes to divorce, bad advice, and drugs, millennials are disproportionately using and abusing these drugs, especially given they are past their youthful experimentation phase. With higher rates of mental illness, it's only logical millennials would have higher rates of psychotherapeutic drug use and abuse. But remember, these are not the fun drugs for getting high, getting laid, recreation, or even eliminating pain. It's to treat a mental illness. It's to cope with basic everyday life. It's just so you can function during the day, make it to bed that night, have that wonderful sleep to take all the pain away, just to wake up and relive that same hell all over again. And it should be no surprise which mental disorders are the usual suspects when it comes to the millennials: depression, anxiety, and ADHD. Nearly every millennial is depressed, so much so it makes Nirvana fans seem like cheery people. So there should be no surprise that antidepressant drug use is at an all-time high, where at one point in time a full third of the American population has been on antidepressants. Millennials, and especially Gen Zers, are notorious for suffering from social anxiety disorder. This was simply diagnosed as being shy 20 years ago, but today it is a mental health crisis, clearly in need of powerful psychotropic drugs. So once again, it should be no surprise that sales of benzodiazepines, anti-anxiety meds, are also at all-time highs, though sales have plateaued since 2013. Prescriptions of methylphenidates, dextroamphetamines, and amphetamines are also at all-time highs, but these drug types are more popularly known by their brand names, Ritalin and Adderall. Though these drugs were concocted to battle the attention deficit disorder crisis of the aughts, the growth in the prescription of these drugs is more likely due to ADHD being discovered and popularized while the millennials were in school. We could go over other types of prescription drug use by the millennial generation, but you will logically find the results the same as the mental illnesses those drugs were created to treat: a general increase in both prevalence and incidence among millennials. There are, however, two important points to be made about millennials, their generational peers, and their respective drug use. First, it should be pointed out that a shockingly high percentage of all Americans are on prescription drugs. It's not just the millennials. Baby boomers, Gen Xers, even Gen Zers are all on drugs at record levels, to where the U.S. Department of Health estimates that now nearly half of Americans, 12 and older, are on some form of psychotherapeutic drug, though this does not corroborate with other statistics measuring overall drug use. Worse, women are estimated to be on psychotropic drugs at rates twice that of men. Regardless, like obesity, there is definitely a society-wide variable driving all people to higher drug usage rates regardless of generation. The problem for millennials, however, is these variables have been at play their entire lives, most notably when ADHD medication was first pushed on them when they were toddlers, giving them a huge head start when it comes to prescription drug use, and Gen Zers an even larger head start than that. They may not be pros like the baby boomers, but they are when adjusting for their age. Give them another 40 years and they'll soon be the reigning world champions, and by a wide margin, when it comes to psychotropic drug use. Second, even though everybody's doing it, it's not so much who's on the prescription and at what numbers, but who's abusing these prescriptions and paying the price in terms of addiction and even death. You can see this in the Adderall epidemic affecting college campuses today, as well as the opioid crisis, both of which disproportionately affect and kill millennials and Gen Zers. But most important is the number of deaths arising from prescription drug overdoses in America. Unfortunately, the data above is for all Americans and is not broken down by age cohort, nor is such data available. But using overall drug overdose deaths as a proxy for prescription drug death, you can see that millennials and admittedly Gen Xers pay the ultimate price when it comes to using these drugs. We can highlight millennials' disastrous mistake to blow $100,000 on completely useless degrees. We can cringe as we see millions of the most educated generation work as cashiers, stock boys, or baristas with their master's degrees. We can laugh at the legions of 30-somethings who still financially suck off their parents' or the taxpayers' teats. And we can shed a tear as a millennial woman is forced to freeze her eggs because big education and big career took her youth from her. But there is nothing more painful than living a mentally tortured life because nobody trained you to handle the real world. And nothing sadder than watching these people slowly being driven insane, even to suicide, because they don't know why. To serve as a warning to others. For whatever criticisms this book may receive about its harshness, callousness, and even being mean, it cannot be denied just what an utter dumpster fire the millennial generation has become. In short, many of the millennials' existences are worse than death, sadly often ending as such by their own hands. It is a miserable existence of pointlessness, futility, purposelessness, uselessness, confusion, loneliness, even parasitism. And because of the immunodeficiency-like aspect of their millennial political religion, many are incapable of ever changing anything and will simply waste their lives. But no matter how impolite and uncomfortable these observations are, the fact remains that the millennials are a failed generation. By every objective measure of human, life, financial, and familial success, they are a failed generation. They are a failed crop. They are unable to support themselves. They aren't even able to Darwinistically replace themselves. Alas, there are only two solutions for dealing with this disaster. One is for the millennials themselves to turn their generational ship around. Put in the overtime. salvage what time remains for their generation, and ensure the legacy they leave history is not merely baby boomers version 2.0. To be a phoenix that rises from its own ashes, learns from its mistakes, and pulls off a Tom Brady 2017 Super Bowl comeback that the world will forever cherish and applaud. In all honesty, it's their only option, because what else do they have to do? The second is for the rest of the world to look at the failed human crop before us and learn from it. To simply view the millennials as a warning to others. That we may not know precisely what to do, but we damn well know what not to do, lest we wish to punish future generations of children like we did the millennials. And while the millennials may ultimately end up becoming a sacrificial generation, at least all future generations can greatly benefit from them, giving the millennial generation incredible value to mankind.